Hello, hello mga kasimple! Mabuhay po kayo at magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Buti po tayo dito sa Pilipinas, tahimik pa ang buhay, pero sa Ukraine po, meron ng ataking ginawa si Putin ng Russia. So hindi na sila ganun katahimik. Nakakakain pa kaya sila? Nakakatulog pa kaya sila? Ang hirap po talaga ng buhay doon. Bago yan, salamat po sa mga subscribers natin na patuloy na pabalik-balik dito sa ating channel. Mga hindi pa po subscribers, bakit hindi pa po kayo mag-subscribe? Kung gusto niyo po ang pinag-uusapan natin ay tungkol sa buhay, tungkol sa pananampalataya, sa pag-asa at pag-ibig, subscribe na po kayo. And hit the notification na rin po para updated kayo sa mga bagong uploads natin. Napakatindi po ng sigalot sa Ukraine at iba po ang picture na nakikita nila sa Russia. So, pakinggan po natin ang diskusyon na ito.
St. Petersburg shelling Russian civilians, yes or no?
No, in Moscow, no.
No
but in
is the
Donetsk,
answer.
yes.
No,
But in Donetsk, yes.
But there
in
are
Donetsk,
Russian,
yes.
but there are, forget Donetsk for a minute, but there are Russian tanks
how can I
shelling
forget
Ukrainian civilians in Kyiv. You keep talking about the past. Let's talk about the present, the here and now. There is an army of 190,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks and artillery and helicopter gunships and cruise missiles and the whole box of military tricks descending on a country that I'm afraid to say does not want you here. Whether you like it or not, they don't want to be liberated or denazified or whatever you want to call it by your soldiers.
My dear counterpart, you chose to say that you agree with the desire for some people or authorities of these people to stay Nazis.
I wondered what you think will this lead to? What's the end game here? Because even if you flatten this country and you occupy it, you're not going to have people welcome you with flowers. So how does this end, Natalia?
This is the federalization of Ukraine, which was the only possible way at the beginning of their state independence to have the state stable, neutral, milking two cows, Russia and the West, but the West didn't want such a Ukraine at all. And if you think that if we didn't do what we now started, and there is no goal to occupy Ukraine, there is a goal of Nazification, denazification, like it was with Germany. But you probably want that new war is started. Ukraine is becoming the trigger for the new Third World War. And we do not want that. And especially
then why did you send? Why did your president send the army in?
If the West didn't sponsor the current philosophy and ideology of Ukraine, if NATO was not approaching our borders, if the West answered our legitimate concerns with regard to our security, there wouldn't have been such a situation now.
So mga kasimple, talang nakita po natin kung gaano ni Natalia, siya po ay isang former Russian politician, kung paano niya po dinidefend talaga yung kanilang stand na kailangan i-denazify yung western border, yung Ukraine po. Kasi ayaw nila na umanib talaga sa NATO. So para po sa Putin government, napakalaking threat po na umanib yung Ukraine sa NATO or North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
But what you're doing, what your army is doing to these people here is destroying their cities, killing their children, killing innocent civilians. That is a real thing. That is a real thing that is happening. And I just wonder where you see this all ending, because you're going to have an Afghanistan on your doorstep. And we know what happened with the Soviet army in Afghanistan. You eventually had to leave, and that was the end of the so-called Soviet empire. So how does this end?
This will end the same happy end as with Nazi Germany. And we will withdraw certainly from Ukraine after this noble and honest goal is, realized. Of course, it is shelling and some people died. But war is war, of course, and it is a drama. And for me is also a drama, because the graves of my grandfather lie in the Chernigov region in Ukraine.
Natalia, finally, it may be a drama for you sitting in your study in Moscow. It's a lot more than a drama for the people getting killed on the ground in Ukraine.
Eto, tingnan po natin kung ano talagang nangyayari on the ground.
Leaving is hard, but some have travelled in the other direction. Some 80,000 Ukrainians have returned since the Russian attack. Many of them men like Vitaly, who was working on a construction site in Poland and has come home to fight.
I came here because my motherland is in trouble. My child, my family and my land are here, so I had to come to protect all of this.
We saw hundreds of cars heading for the border, where we found Maria, who isn't crossing, but returning to Kyiv to help others prepare for the journey. When you look at the border here, do you feel any temptation to cross yourself?
No, but it's a rather strange feeling to understand that there it's absolutely safe, but I don't want to go there. I know that it would be good and safe and nice, but I really feel that I need to be there.
You need to be in Kyiv. Yep. Why?
It's my city, it's my country, and we need to have possibility to be all together, to support each other and to show that we are not afraid.
We came across a group of foreign students who were leaving, saying a last goodbye. But some Ukrainians see now as their moment to stay right here.
Full-scale invasion.
Была паника, истерика, слезы.
Как у нас пламя было выше дома.
We're like in a cellar. I'm not sure if it's like deep enough to help us to survive.
Ito po ang map na nagpapakita kung saan po yung mga arrows na yan, nakikita yung attack ng Russia sa Ukraine. Tingnan nyo naman po kung anong sitwasyon nila na ganito, sinira na yung kanilang mga cities, and 500,000 po sa kanila ay umaalis na, lumalabas na po ng Ukraine. Ito po yung pinakamalaking war na nangyari pagkatapos po ng Second World War, according to the news.
Putin has long claimed Ukraine belongs to Russia and they are one people.
We're not just close neighbors, we're one nation.
But Ukraine is a sovereign nation with its own language, culture, and political system. And while the two countries do have a shared history, Ukraine has fought hard for its own identity. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought down the empire and the region spiraled into a civil war. Ukraine briefly gained independence from Russian rule, but was quickly taken over by the newly created Soviet Union as one of its first republics. Over the next decade, the Soviet Union brutally expanded its control, and by the end of World War II, it forged a sphere of influence over here, while the West held its influence over here, essentially dividing Europe and marking the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union installed communist governments on their side, which were easy for them to control. But the West developed into democracies with capitalist economies. The deep ideological divide fueled distrust and tensions between the two sides, and soon these spheres hardened into military alliances. In 1949, these countries, along with the US and Canada, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and promised to defend each other from invasion. A few years later, these countries joined the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance, and each side built up its military to protect itself from the other. Europe remained this way for decades, until one side finally collapsed. By late 1991, republics like Ukraine began declaring independence from Soviet domination. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent countries, including a much weaker Russia. And the Soviet sphere of influence disappeared as many countries overthrew their communist governments. Even though the Cold War ended, the alliance on the other side of Europe was still going strong. In fact, it was expanding. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, 7 more countries joined. That moved NATO into the old Soviet sphere of influence, bringing NATO to Russia's border for the first time. Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia were now the last post-Soviet countries left between Russia and NATO. But Ukraine and Georgia both wanted to join NATO for a long time, and that made them prime targets for Russia. Ukraine became a NATO partner in 1994, which brought them a step closer to becoming a member.
Україна буде в НАТО. Це історична подія для нашого народу.
And in 2013, they reached an association agreement with the European Union. But when it came time to sign the deal, Ukraine's pro-Russian government refused. Instead, they chose to strengthen ties with Russia. After the decision was announced, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets to demand the agreement be signed. After months of peaceful protests, the Ukrainian president cracked down and killed more than 100 people, sparking more protests, which eventually drove the president out of office and the country. This meant Putin was losing political influence over Ukraine, so he decided to use force instead. First, he invaded and annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. Then, Russia-backed separatists captured the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and declared them independent of Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine has been locked in a conflict with Russia that has killed 14,000 people and displaced nearly 2 million. For nearly 8 years, Putin has held on to these regions, destabilizing Ukraine and keeping it from moving closer to the West. But in November 2021, Putin decided to go all in. Satellite images showed at least 100,000 Russian troops and military equipment piling up along the border of Ukraine. Putin repeatedly denied any plans to invade, but weeks later, he presented his demands to the West. His main demand was that NATO stop expanding and move its military borders back to where they were in 1997, away from Russia's. Western leaders rejected his demands. Instead, they put forces on standby and reinforced their military presence in Eastern Europe. Back at Ukraine's border, Russian troops continued to gather. And over here, along its border with Belarus, Russia began conducting huge military drills. On February 21st, the threat of war became real.
Считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение. Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
His troops immediately crossed the Ukrainian border into Russian-backed separatist regions under the pretense of peacekeeping. Ukraine announced a state of emergency, and President Zelensky made a direct appeal to the Russian people.
Война лишит гарантий всех. Гарантий безопасности не будет больше ни у кого. Кто от этого пострадает больше всего? Люди. Кто этого не хочет больше всего? Люди. Кто может этого не допустить? Люди.
Hours later, on February 24th, Putin launched a full-scale invasion in Ukraine.
Специальной военной операции.
World leaders have spoken out against Russia's invasion.
We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Anti-war protests have broken out around the world, including in Russia, despite the risk of arrest. Neighboring nations have opened their borders as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians attempt to flee. NATO's response force has been activated for the first time in history, and the US has sent additional troops to Eastern Europe. But in many ways, the world is treading carefully. Putin controls the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons and has already threatened anyone who might interfere.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
So countries around the world are imposing some of the harshest economic sanctions to slow Putin down and sending tons of military aid to support Ukraine. For now, Russian forces keep pushing deeper, but Ukraine is fighting back.
Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде й далі.
And we've seen the pictures of ordinary civilians arming themselves, making Molotov cocktails and so on. Are you arming yourself? Are you preparing to fight?
Well, every citizen prepares to fight. So different people doing different types of activities. I have to say, every person I know of my friends already have weapons ready.
What has been done is unprecedented. The economic, diplomatic, and other sanctions taken against Russia, its financial system, its banks, its oligarchs, and others are really quite extraordinary. But again, I do not think that it is wise to put American or British or other NATO forces in on the ground in Ukraine to where they can end up clashing directly with Russian forces or in the air where there could be an inadvertent incident as well. I just think that that would be very unwise.